Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our webinar on contemporary Ukrainian poetry after the 24th of February, 2022. The poetry webinar is part 5 in a special series of online events titled Russia's War on Ukraine, co-hosted by the Melbourne Eurasianist Seminar Series at the University of Melbourne, the Ukrainian Studies Foundation in Australia, and the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand. My name is Alessandro Achilli. I'm a senior assistant professor of Slavic Studies at the University of Cagliari, Italy, and I'll be chairing this webinar. The series has been conceived as a platform to share knowledge on today's Ukraine, something which is definitely much needed, and as a way to pay our respect to the Ukrainian people who are fighting a defensive war with a level of courage and endurance, not only for themselves and their children, but for the whole of the free world, that is truly remarkable. We encourage our audience to ask questions to our panelists using the Q&A function in your Zoom screen. We'll discuss all questions at the end in the Q&A session, but don't hesitate to put your questions throughout the webinar. We have 4 speakers today: Associate Professor William Blecker, Yulia Musakovska, Leszek Panasiuk, and Dr. Irina Shuvalova. Each speaker has 20 minutes for their presentations, during which we will hear both papers and poems. I'll now introduce our first speaker. William Blecker is Associate Professor of Comparative East European Culture at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, University College, London. His research includes cultural memory, urban memory, memory politics in Ukraine and Poland, Ukraine's multilingual literary heritage, and contemporary Ukrainian war literature. He's the author of Memory, Forgetting, and the Legacy of World War II in East Central Europe, Ghosts of Others, Routledge 2019, co-author of Remembering Katyn, Polity 2012, and co-editor of Memory and Theory in Eastern Europe, Palgrave 2013. His translations of Ukrainian authors have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. The title of William's presentation is Writing Around War, a Selective and Subjective Overview of Recent Ukrainian War Literature. William, please, the floor is yours. William, I can't hear.
I've unmuted myself. Okay, I'll start again. Thank you so much, Alessandro, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak alongside such an amazing panel of writers, and I'm really looking forward to listening to them read their work. So I'll say a few words about the new Ukrainian war literature. It's a large, by now, body of work. You know, the war started obviously not in February this year, but in 2014. And since then, many writers have written about this topic. It's a very diverse literature. It's quite difficult to kind of make any general characterizations or conclusions, but I'll make a few observations based on what I've read, which is certainly not everything in this new war literature. I think the first thing to note about it is that it's an interesting body of literature in that it's written to an extent by professional writers and to an extent by non-professional writers. So we had, even from the early days of the war, lots and lots of literature written by soldiers, by volunteers, often memoirs of service, but also in other genres like poetry. And most of those are small self-published books, but some of those writers did become well-known names in Ukrainian literature through that route. So people who didn't have literary ambitions, particularly before the war, through writing about the war became more well-known. And there is now, this phenomenon of veterans literature in Ukraine. At the same time, you have obviously established writers who write about the war, and some of those have been serving on the front line. They have been affected as internally displaced people, and been affected in various ways by the war. And they've written about their own experiences often. And then there are those who, for example, maybe observe the war from greater distance, whether in the parts of Ukraine not affected or from outside of Ukraine. So there are a whole range of different perspectives that writers are coming to this topic from. Another thing I think it's worth mentioning is that there's a certain maybe shift or realignment in the geography of Ukrainian literature. Certainly after 2014, with the war happening in the east of Ukraine and Donbass, we see the voices from those regions becoming more prominent, more important, as people look to writers from there to kind of speak about these events, to interpret them, explain them, somehow represent them, somehow make them present in literature. And those are often writers who have been first-hand witnesses of events. Some of them are writers who've been forced to leave Donbass, so people like Lyuba Yakimchuk, Elena Styashkina, Volodymyr Rafeenko, but also, writers like Serhiy Zhadan, for example, who comes from also the affected region, have, in Zhadan's case, already a very prominent writer, but becoming, I would say, even more prominent through both writing about the war and activism. And that's another question which, we could discuss, is this kind of overlap between the role of the writer and the role of the volunteer or activist in all of this. And since we have writers coming from Eastern Ukraine who are becoming maybe more central to the literary process, that involves writers who are Russophone writers who write in Russian, or who had previously written predominantly in Russian. So I'm thinking in particular two important examples would be Elena Styashkina and Volodymyr Rafeenko. We could also mention Stanislav Aseyev, for example, who wrote in both language in his journalism. And in the case of Rafeenko and Styashkina, very interesting, because these were writers who had earlier in their careers oriented themselves towards the Russian language audience, often working with Russian journals, competing for Russian literary prizes. And after the beginning of the war in 2014, they made a sort of principled, both of them were forced to leave Donetsk. They're both from Donetsk, and they also made this kind of principled stance to move towards Ukrainian literature. And you see that they reorientate their works to a certain degree towards different thematics, in that sense, maybe more Ukrainian focused thematics, and in both cases begin to use Ukrainian language more in their work. And indeed, Rafeenko, for example, who written all his novels in Russian, wrote his first novel in Ukrainian, which came out just a couple of years ago. So with that, we have that interesting dynamic as well. But I think it's not just that these writers' works have changed. I think the Ukrainian literary process has also been changed by those writers. I think the writers from Donbass who are on this kind of borderland and operating between the languages and between the cultures have gained this kind of authoritative voice within literature, which is interesting and which maybe was not so prominent before. In terms of the genres of Ukrainian war literature, it embraces all genres, obviously. Poetry, drama, prose. Also, I think maybe slightly outside of our remit today, but film has been very interesting, developments in both fiction and documentary film. And certainly, I think poetry is definitely worth focusing on. It's been one of the most important genres, if not the most important genre in the world literature, I would say. Because of the nature of the genre, yeah, poetry is a short form. It's a form which is easy to, well, easy, maybe not easy, but quicker to produce, and also easier to distribute, and especially through social media. So it's been very, very interesting to observe how social media has functioned as a kind of literary medium throughout, during Maidan and afterwards. Poets are very often publishing their work first on Facebook. Facebook seems to be the main social media channel for this. And very quickly and very effectively reaching readers. So you have a very fast turnaround between events and the production and distribution of texts. And that's been a sort of remarkable thing to observe. And it also means that poetry and poets kind of enter into this informational sphere, online informational sphere, and become sort of important parts of that. Another thing I think it's worth thinking about is, or something that's been very notable, is the turn towards documentary nonfiction forms. And even poetry, to an extent, takes on this kind of more documentary feel. And some poets writing about the war have even described their own work in those terms. So Lyuba Yakimchuk, for example, talks about her own work as being sort of documentary poetry, taking kind of language that's found in the real world around the war and turning it into to poetry to an extent. And this is, to a large degree, I think, to do with problems around the ethics of bearing witness to traumatic events, to extreme violence. We know from literary history and from literary criticism that these are problems that have been very characteristic of the 20th century. We all know about, writings of Adorno and Agamben and others about the imperative to bear witness to things, but also the inherent difficulties. And often the turn away from fiction and away from aestheticization is a response to that kind of ethical imperative to bear witness to facts, to reality. And in that we also see a questioning of the role of the writer in poetry. So a lot of the poets that I've read, and Irina Shovalova has some interesting poems about this, have sort of expressed a certain anxiety about writing poetry in this situation, and the need to search for a new kind of language to describe it. This has also led, this kind of more general situation has led, moving away from poetry has led to an increasing prominence in nonfiction prose as well. So we can talk about memoirs, we can talk about diary forms, so Andrei Kurkov recently published his diaries of the war, but also writers like Artem Chekh, so his memoir of his frontline service, translated as Absolute Zero. Olesya Tromeychuk's book about the loss of her brother who was serving on the front line. So this kind of memoir form, which maybe has been less prominent in Ukrainian literature before, non-fiction forms have maybe not been so prominent in the last few decades, have become much more so after the war. And again, this is related to this maybe turn to the documentary, turn to the factual. And another thing that maybe more specific aspect of all this that I would like to highlight, and it's something that I wrote about, I published an article on this topic just recently in East-West Journal of Ukrainian Studies, who did a special issue on the war and culture. is something that the literary scholar Kate McLaughlin has called parapolemics. In her writing about war literature. And this is a term which describes the tendency to talk around the edges of war. So often when we think about war in culture, we think about battles. We think about, you know, maybe blockbuster movies where there's lots of fighting. We might think about the political dimensions of all this, you know, the generals and the politicians who are leading this. But parapolemic literature avoids those things and looks at what we might call the outskirts, or maybe the sort of backstage of the war. You know, we haven't talked about theatre of war, where things happen, but what's happening around in the backstage or in the wings. And that can be looking at the writing about things like things happening before conflict or immediately after, and also in spaces away from the epicenters of violence. So talking about, you know, this could be training, soldiers in training, it could be checkpoints and trenches between battles, it could be the streets of the frontline cities, people's homes under conditions of bombardment, these sort of things. It's also a way of shifting the focus to the civilian experience. It's also often a way of speaking about the experience of those who generally are not involved directly in combat. So that would be, to a larger degree, women, but also we can speak about children, older people. We can speak about disabled people. If we think about Serhii Jadan's novel, The Orphanage, for example, where the character is not accompanied because of disability. And this allows the writer to avoid, on the one hand, those difficulties in representation of extreme traumatic violence, you know, and we know that obviously traumatic experience is notoriously difficult to access, it's difficult to represent. So taking a step back from that and looking at things happening around it is a way of speaking about it in a different way, in a less direct way, but often in a more powerful way. And it also avoids the kind of cliched strong stories of heroism that we are familiar with from the kind of stereotypical image of war. And it also allows writers to access a lot of the ambiguity of the experience of war. So this is something that we find often in the literature, is a focus on the sort of what we might call the gray zones of war, you know, sort of areas of confusion, disorientation, which characterize the experience of war. You know, in Andrei Kurkov's book, which is one of the best known in translation, at least, Grey Bees is all about this kind of gray zone, this kind of no man's land, people inhabiting no man's land, and the general disorientation and confusion that often, and ambivalence and ambiguity that characterizes these experiences. This can also be connected to this idea of the documentary, I think. So think about Natalia Vorozhbit, for example, one of Ukraine's most important screenwriters and dramatists. She wrote a very famous now play called Bad Roads, which was turned into a movie, which is based on, again, interviews with people. So it has this documentary basis to it, interviews with people carried out on the front line or near the front line, and focuses on very much on spaces away from the fighting, on, you know, the experience of teenage girls in a frontline town, for example, these kind of things. What I've been saying so far is mainly referring to observations of literature written before February. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about what happens after February. It's early, obviously, to say. And again, I think because of that, you know, the factor of the turnaround in literary responses, we have at the moment basically just poetry to judge. And again, it's been really, really remarkable to see the poetry that's been produced since February. Really, I would say some of the most powerful poetry that I've ever read. Writers like Irina Shavalova, Iakiwa, Katarina Kalitko, Yulia Musakovska, many others. The only other probably genre that we could talk about here is maybe essays, and this is one thing that I was, sort of responses, immediate sort of prose responses to the events that have been published in often in newspapers or websites, and that's something that I've been involved in a little bit as a translator, and that was very interesting to observe what writers were writing when an editor of a Western newspaper or website comes to a Ukrainian writer and asks them to write something about what's happening in the first couple of weeks of the invasion, and there was a kind of, I would say, mismatch between expectations and what was delivered. The texts were very, I think the editors wanted a kind of quite maybe sort of poetic reflections on the shock of the war, maybe also reflection on certain political factors that in their view needed to be addressed, questions of identity and language and stuff like that, the usual things that kind of stereotypical problems that people like to associate with Ukraine, supposed divisions in society and so on and so on. Instead, Ukrainian writers were giving them texts which were very, very raw, which were basically consisted of the expression of raw emotion. They were, and I think to the editors, they often seemed rather over the top, rather melodramatic, rather too emotional, not exactly what they were looking for. They speak in the language of patriotism. They speak about things like hatred, and they speak very, very openly and unashamedly about love. The sort of things that these editors were perhaps not entirely ready for, and perhaps readers also. Observing that, I guess I became aware of a problem in the production and reception of the literature. And here I'm talking mainly about in translation, which is that there has to be, I guess, a certain kind of adjustment of expectations on behalf of Western readers on what they can expect from the culture of a country that's under war, that's in conditions of war. But also the Ukrainian writers themselves, you can see that this is a real challenge for them to find a language which will express what they want to express with the power they want, with the necessary and desired effect, but not alienating these kind of rather sensitive readers that they're dealing with. Obviously, we will see, the development of the literature further. We'll see other genres joining where poetry and shorter form essays have led. I think that what we will see, however, is that this war literature, before, if we hadn't had February, the invasion of February, I think the war literature would have continued to be an important element of Ukrainian literature for some time to come, but it would have kind of faded into the background a little bit. Now, I think we're probably looking at Ukrainian culture being very much defined by this for some time to come, for many years, maybe even generations to come. And this is going to be very, very difficult for the writers to rise to this challenge. I mean, by all accounts and by all the evidence, they, of course, will be capable of doing that. But I think we'll see, again, the topic of trauma, topic of working through trauma, of bearing witness, of testimony, of striving for justice, culture and literature as a weapon in a struggle for justice. We'll see that these will be characteristic features of the poetry and the literature going forward. I think there will also be, and I'm thinking about work that I've done previously on things like Polish literature about the Katyn massacres, where you had many, many years of cultural production about this crime which had not been recognized and which the perpetrator had not been brought to account for. And we have obviously very extreme examples of that in Ukraine today. And I think, again, we will see this search for justice, for recognition of the crimes, and also for the perpetrator to be brought to justice, but also for the recognition from the side of the perpetrator of the crimes, will be an important element of the way that this is going to be written about and represented in Ukrainian culture. So this will be, I think, a long and complicated and difficult process, but as I say, judging by reactions so far, I think something that Ukrainian literature will obviously a challenge that Ukrainian literature will rise to. Okay, I'll stop now.
Thank you very much, William, for this extremely broad and comprehensive overview of contemporary Ukrainian literature and culture, and I'm sure your paper will help many in the audience to better understand, follow, and contextualize the talks and the readings that we are going to hear soon. So thank you very much again. Our second panelist today is Yulia Musakowska. Yulia Musakowska was born in 1982 in Lviv, Ukraine. She's an award-winning poet, translator, and member of PEN Ukraine. She's the author of 5 poetry collections in Ukrainian, most recently The God of Freedom, Box for Body, 2021, and the bilingual collection Iron, Żelazo Zalizo in Polish and Ukraine, 2022. She has received numerous literary awards in Ukraine, among them the prestigious Smoloskip Poetry Award for Young Authors and the Dictum Prize. Her individual poems have been translated into more than 20 languages and published internationally, with recent works appearing in Agni, the Apophenia magazine, Life and Legends, the Springhouse Journal, One Art, Red Letters, and others. Yulia is also a translator of Thomas Tranströmer to Ukrainian and of contemporary Ukrainian authors to English. Please, Yulia, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I will be sharing mostly my personal, perhaps very subjective experience on how the relationship with the language changed after February 24th and how it affected writing poetry. So looking back on the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I think that no one of us actually believed it would happen, that the Russian bombs will start falling on our peaceful cities. And even despite Russia's long history of brutality towards Ukraine and its neighboring countries. So the February invasion came as a shock. So how else would you react to facing an absolute evil? What happens with the language while you're in shock? Well, it freezes. So you're getting numb and you're losing the ability to speak, to find the right words, to find words at all. And in the meantime, the outside world is trying to get these words out of you as an author. So I remember receiving dozens of messages from my friends and colleagues worldwide on the first days of the full-scale invasion. Everybody was worried and asking how things are and offering all kinds of help. So I was mostly answering these in English, which is also my familiar working tool. My daily job is within information technologies, where I'm responsible for marketing at a Ukrainian IT firm. So I spent the first weeks after Russians invaded writing endless business communication in English to our foreign clients and partners to keep the business afloat, because everyone was extremely worried. And I was also answering my friends writing to me from abroad. And then I actually wrote my first poem after February 24th in English, as it felt nearly impossible to use Ukrainian to express what was happening, and especially what I was feeling at that moment. In Ukrainian, I was still speechless. I also think there was some sort of denial due to this trauma that we experienced, that you are unwilling to verbalize something because it could become real, and it's about expressing this in your native language. But everything was, of course, real, and the atrocities were real, and one has to realize that at some point. So the sounds of air raid alerts and explosions were real, and the news about the horrible events concerning the friends and the friends' families, and it was very real. But it took some time to acknowledge that. So when I was writing that very first poem after February invasion, it was not intended to be a poem, merely a recording of events and my feelings at that moment. Just simple statements of worry about family and friends, and all of these emotions, and then also the statements of Russians' army crimes. And for more people to understand it through English, it was my intention. So there was nothing artistic in that text, because also English has always been my business communication language, not a language for writing poetry. However, my Polish translator, Aneta Kaminska, who is a great promoter of Ukrainian poetry in Poland, translated it immediately, and it was then published in Poland's most popular daily newsletter, Gazeta Wyborcza. And also she convinced me to include it into the book that came out later that was mentioned, called Żelazo in Polish and Iron in Ukrainian. But then I'm still not 100% sure that it is a poem. One thing was pretty clear, that the poetry after the invasion is not going to be the same, as the world would not be the same. So rediscovering Ukrainian as a language of poetry has been difficult, but there was also deciding what to do with Russian language. I come from a bilingual family, so my parents usually speak this daily Russian at home, but they also felt it was wrong to continue doing so, especially after the crimes of Bucha were discovered. So they switched to Ukrainian in their everyday talking, and it also came very naturally, as they have a great command of the language and are very used to speaking it outside of the home. And as for me, Russian has never been a language of writing for me. However, I know the many authors in Ukraine, and some of them we have already mentioned, that are sort of casting this language aside, as for them it is now the language of the brutal aggressors, the murderers, and they in no way want to be associated with it. Instead, Ukrainian and writing in Ukrainian and speaking it creates a sense of absolute belonging, unity, and also shows a very distinct and undoubtable identity. So coming back to the subject of writing poetry and why the reasons for writing poetry right now in this time. How is one supposed to write poems after the falling bombs, the destroyed cities, and discovered mass burials of tortured innocent people, often civilians and even children. And when a missile kills entire families in the light of the day in a city in the middle of Europe, how is and why is one supposed to talk about it through poetry? So the next emotion that comes after the shock is weakening its grip, is the desire to scream out loud. And here's, of course, recalling this Adorno's famous quote about writing poetry after Auschwitz, which he thought was barbaric. And I was telling myself the same thing when my first poems were coming after the beginning of February invasion. How can one continue writing in fine words after Bucha massacre, after Mariupol destruction, after Vinnytsia terrorist act committed by Russians in broad daylight? But then again, these poems were completely different from those that I wrote before. Even though I have been writing about Russia's war in Ukraine since it started in 2014, writing after February 24th felt like learning to speak all over again. It was almost physically painful. But I would say that the primary reason for writing poetry now is trying to comprehend the horrible events, this new reality, by expressing it in words. Also, it is some sort of coping mechanism to cope with these events. And of course, there is a quick reaction, the opportunity to react quickly, to let the public all over the world know what's happening, as poetry has this ability to connect on the emotional level while reacting very quickly to the events. And also an important function is giving people, most importantly, the people in Ukraine, the readers, the opportunity to join in an emotion, whether it's love or hate, joy or grief, and also, of course, hope. So what I see is the language of new war poetry became more austere, more dry and factual, and it's more like a documentary language. So these poems are reports on the events made to remember, reports of atrocities, of courage and resilience, personal stories with pretty much nothing fictional about them. The metaphors, if any, are very down to earth, very plain, and also recognizable from day-to-day war reality. And with each horrible event, each major loss, each heartbreaking news, we are picking up the pieces of the broken language and putting it back together to be able to speak about these unimaginable things, because we cannot keep silent. The world must know that Russia is a terrorist state and Ukraine is a free country that will defend its freedom and its identity. So this year we are observing increased interest to Ukraine, to Ukrainian culture, and poetry is an important part of it. Ukrainian poetry about war has been translated to many languages, and authors have been invited to perform at events internationally to spread the word. And I have been a part of numerous Zoom events and also performed at 5 festivals in Poland, Lithuania, Czech, and also Malta. And it seems to me that Ukraine is finally being perceived as a separate entity, not a former faceless colony of Russia, a post-Soviet state. And our history and cultural heritage is arousing much interest, and the language too. I have heard from people from abroad coming from the audience when I was reading my poems, asking questions like, is this Ukrainian? It sounds nothing like Russian. Or it's a beautiful sounding language, very melodic. It has music in it. So people were actually realizing the existence of Ukrainian language. So on Malta, where I delivered a performance consisting of poetry, music, and visuals, accompanied by a Ukrainian actress and singer, Marichka Sterbulova, we decided that even if English is a universal language, the languages that should sound on stage will be Ukrainian and Maltese, as these were the languages of the former colonized countries that must sound louder, must be amplified. And this was very well received and appreciated by the Maltese public, and this strengthened this effect of solidarity. So as Ukrainians are suffering because of Russia's aggression, as we are all living inside this war, our ties with the language are strengthening because it is an integral part of our identity as Ukrainians and as poets as well. There is a sense of pride, sense of empowerment of writing in Ukrainian. This language that was banned so many times throughout the history, and that is now a target of attack and is seen as threat by a huge monstrous state. But anyway, it has survived and is thriving, and it will be, of course. So this is everything on the paper side I had for today, and I am going to read several of my poems that were written after February 24th. And these were also, most of them were included into the new book, Iron, that came out this year, and it's available in both Polish and Ukrainian. It's a bilingual edition. And I will read the first poems in Ukrainian, and the English translation was done by a wonderful poet and translator from New York, Olena Jennings, in collaboration with myself. So let me start. Кожна звістка про смерть, зламану долю, зруйнований дім, наче дірка у тілі, швидко закрита металевою латкою. Скоро там не залишиться живого місця. Залізний дроворуб, пекельний андроїд, досконала машина. Міцна оболонка, наповнена болем і люттю. Немає у світі страшнішої зброї, потужнішого механізму. Немає небезпечнішого супротивника. Тихо, серце моє, заткнися, завмри. Зараз не час. And in English, this poem has a title, Pulse. Every message of death, a ruined life, a destroyed home, is like a hole punched in your body, quickly patched with metal. Soon there will be no place left to cover. A tin man, an infernal android, a perfect machine, a steady shell filled with pain and rage. There is no deadlier weapon, no more powerful mechanism. There is no more dangerous enemy. Hush, my heart. Shut up. Be still. It's not the time. And then the next one. Дивилися на голе, розтерзане тіло моєї вітчизни. Знімали і публікували фото і відео високої роздільної здатності. Жахалися, засуджували, непокоїлися, присмокували. Гучно вболівали і підбадьорювали. Дивувалися, що ще жива. Захоплювалися стійкістю і хоробрістю. Пропонували їжу і питво, вологі серветки, ліжко-місце, дозвіл на працю. І все задармо. Поки скажений пес виривав з її тіла криваві шматки м'яса за мізинець до сонної артерії. Зібрався цілий натовп людей при повному озброєнні, але ніхто не натиснув на спусковий гачок, аби його раптом не струснуло віддачею. So in English, this poem is called The Body of My Homeland. They've been looking at the naked, ravaged body of my homeland, taking and posting photos and videos in high resolution. They were shocked and judgmental, concerned and tongue-clicking, cheering and supporting her loudly, surprised she's still alive, impressed by her courage and resilience. They offered her food and drink, wet wipes, a bed to sleep in, a work permit, all of this free of charge, while a mad dog was ripping bloody pieces of meat from her body, an inch from the carotid. The entire crowd of fully armed people gathered, but no one dared to pull the trigger, not to be shaken by a recoil. And the next one in this series. Такі незручні, такі страшні вірші, повні люті, такі неполіткоректні. Жодної в цих віршах краси, жодної естетики. Метафори сохли і розсипались, не забуявши. Метафори, закопані на дитячих майданчиках під нашвидкоруч збитими хрестами. Завмерлі у неприродних позах біля під'їздів будинків, присипані пилом. Готували їжу на відкритому вогні, намагалися вижити. Загинули від зневоднення під завалами. Розстріляні в авто під білим прапором із простирадла, з яскравими наплічниками за спиною, лежать на асфальті до лілиць, поруч із котами і псами. Даруйте, але такі вірші – це все, що маємо для вас на сьогодні, шановні пані та панове. глядачі театру війни. So this poem was translated to English by Anatoly Kudravitsky, and when translated, it has the title Metaphors. Such awkward, terrible poems, soaked with rage, controvertible, no beauty in them, no aesthetics, metaphors withered and scattered, deprived of blooming, metaphors buried on playgrounds under hastily made crosses, frozen in unnatural poses across the thresholds, strewn with dust, cooking food over an open fire in attempt to survive, metaphors dying of dehydration under the rubble, shot in the car under a makeshift white flag, lying on the footpath with motley backpacks on their backs, next to their executed cats and dogs. Forgive me, but such poems are all we have for you today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear estimable spectators in the theater of war. So I will read the next ones in English, and again, these were translated by Alana Jennings and myself. Bundle of grief. I'm carrying our bundle of grief in a crowded street. My grief is crying, strained, and the passerbys are annoyed. Console your grief. Stop this lamenting. Cover it to make it warm, feed it and rock it to sleep. Grief is grief. Everyone has it. My grief is pressing its burning forehead against my chest. In its eyes, thousands of us massacred here and now. Keep crying my grief. Cry. Stones and nails. Magnolia is blooming in someone else's garden. I feel like dying, but I must speak up. With a mouth full of stones and nails, a mouth full of blood. Saying the words for those whose souls were removed from their bodies. How do you know what they wanted to say? Speak, poet. Speak though you have no right. The moment it becomes unbearable, just spit out blood through stones and nails and continue to speak. The heart, a squashed apple, is falling apart. Flowers are proudly open to the spring sun. The shamelessness of nature, the shame of survivors, sharp stones of words in the dried out mouth. And the last one for today has been translated by Olena Jennings and Ella Yevtushenko. Words. Who said that words have no value now? Our words that are being written in the air with the incandescent iron of breath that strike like clotted blood on pale lips are cutting into the soil under our feet, settling on our clothes and shoes like dust from ruined homes. Our words are stretching to those dear to us, to everyone who is scattered around the country's map with bullet holes in it. Words like strong connecting wires attached to the heart along the tight ropes of lasting together. How much we can love as one, how much we can hate. The words we put into a backpack just before leaving. The words we grab to maintain who knows what kind of balance when the ground is kicked out from under our feet like an unsteady stool. The words we press to a gaping wound, the torn tender belly of the teenage girl, safety. Our words, hard and swollen with rage, black from grief, like the concrete ceiling of an old bomb shelter. There is nothing more durable, nothing less fleeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for sharing with us in a very personal but also clear way your experience of writing again in a way after the 24th of February and for reading those extremely powerful poems. So thank you very much indeed. Our next presenter today is Leszek Panasiuk. Leszek is a writer, translator, and designer and artist from Bucha. He's the author of 3 poetry collections in Ukrainian, Kamień Deszczu, Rainstone 2013, winner of the Young Republic of Poets Prize, Spravžnje Jablko, Real Apple 2014, winner of the Smoloskip Literary Prize, and Krekeruk, Screams of Hands 2018. Named one of the best poetry books of 2018 by PEN Ukraine. He has also books in translation published in Romanian and Russian, and individual works translated into 22 languages. He's a translator and co-translator of books by Valzhina Mort, Serhei Prelutsky, Dmitry Kuzmin, Artyom Verle, and 3 anthologies of Belarusian literature. He's also co-translator of a libretto titled Limbus Limbo by Patrick Hahn for an exhibition titled Korisne Kopaliny, Subsoil Assets 2021. He's a laureate of numerous literary and art contests and the recipient of fellowships from the President of Ukraine, the International Writers and Translators House, the House of Europe, and the Staromiejski House of Culture, and the Shevchenko Scientific Society. The title of Leszek's presentation today is Poetry in Times of War, the Need for Dialogue and a New Language. Please, Leszek, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. Based on my own experience, I want to tell you about the connection between the war and the text. Yulia also talked a little about it. War is a new, different reality, and our language of peacetime does not fit for it. I'll start from the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014. After the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian-Ukrainian war, I didn't write for about a year because I realized that I didn't have the appropriate language to talk about the events that took place. Only in the second half of 2014, I started writing again. And these poems, they're both similar and not similar to my poems that I had written before. I had no experience of war from 2014 to 2021, but the war was constantly in the news. I heard many stories from acquaintances and friends who lost their own homes, relatives. So the war was always present in my reality. Sometimes more, sometimes less. This can be seen in my poems written during that period. The war is always behind these poems. They were quite disturbing, with a looming threat somewhere nearby. Mm, the end of 2021 and the beginning of 2022 had reached the peak of the threat. Russia was concentrating its forces around the borders of Ukraine, and everyone was talking about the possibility of full-scale war. At the time, I wanted to organize my reality because it seemed uncertain. As always, everything started with language. It is the first to respond to changes. I started writing poems that have a clear structure: haiku, tanka, sedoka, cinquain, tetractys, etc. It calmed me down. Then I saw a short poem by Oleg Kotsarev, which had a clear 2-2-2 structure. I offered to try to develop this form because it is beautiful and conscious. Bohuslav Polak offered the title, and we started to develop this genre. Zhuk, or poetry zhuk. Zhuk means beetle in Ukrainian. This genre is a three-line poem consisting of 6 syllables. The genre got its name because its structure resembles the morphology of beetles. They have 3 pairs of limbs, just like the poetry zhuk, 3 lines with 2 syllables. 2 days before the full-scale war, we presented its genre. We have developed 4 subspecies of this genre: ordinary beetle, brittle beetle, laced beetle, and cracked beetle. Also, each subspecies has the name of a specific beetle in Ukrainian. These poems stick to a clear form, but in most subspecies of zhuk, the words fall apart, as does the reality in which they were created. Only in ordinary beetle, words do not break. In brittle beetle, words are broken between lines. In laced beetle, they are broken between lines and flow. In cracked beetle, they are broken up into syllables, separate letters, forming a plurality of readings. After the new phase of the war, which began on February 24th, the war was no longer only in the east of Ukraine. It came to my home. I lived in Bucha, which is close to Gostomel airport, which we tried to seize from the first day. As we now understand, according to witnesses, we were able to locate it with the Rena Gladun at the last moment. We could get to Khmelnytsky, where I stayed, and Rena went abroad. And it turned out naturally that we started writing poems together because we needed a dialogue. In our joint poem, we tried to constantly invent new language for this new war reality. So there is a lot of experiments in the poems. Some even have no text. It is visual poetry. I also have to say that until February 24th, I rarely post poems on my social networks and occasionally read other poems, other people's poems. But now that has changed. Poems have become a new form of communication with Ukrainians and people from abroad. Now I'm going to read you some of my poems. I won't read Beatles because these poems are more for readers than for listeners. I'll start with a poem I wrote in 2014. I told you about it before. Липень. Сьогодні раптово сховалося серце і поснули пальці. Борсався з туманом і нічого не відчував. Ні дна човна, яким бавиться хвиля, ні зеленої лапи ялини не відчував. Спробував читати чужі вірші, але бачив тільки жаль. Подумав було читати історичні книжки, але яка ж історія? Нема ніякої історії і не було ніколи. Замість історичних книжок друкуйте чорнильні плями. Ми завжди жили в казках. Я, до прикладу, виріс із яблуневого зернятка. Лежу горілиць, але ніхто не нап'ється з очей моїх. Ні птаха, ні корова, ні пес приблуда. Бо сьогодні сховалося серце і поснули пальці. Як у цей день налаштувати гітару? Як у цей день співати? Приваю язик свій і кидаю у небо, бо сьогодні найбільше хочу говорити. Але слова тепер не мають значення. Не треба нічого. Все ясно і так, бо серця нема, а може ніколи й не було. Просто віриш в книжці з анатомії, а сам живеш у казці. І пальці тепер, як олівці з загубленими стрижнями, як бджоли, що вжалили вперше й востаннє. А серце? Що серце? Порожня каструля, дзвенить при кожному необережному рухові. А зараз і воно сховалось. Навіть липень тепер який. Не читає тобі твоїх улюблених поетів, навіть не говорить до тебе. Забирає людей, забирає пальці, забирає серце. In English, it called Julie. The heart has suddenly hidden today, and the fingers have fallen asleep. I floundered in fog, but there was nothing to feel. Neither the bottom of a boat waves were playing with, nor a green paw of a fir tree, nothing to feel. I tried reading the others' poems, but found only regrets. I thought of reading history books, but what is history? The history doesn't exist and hasn't ever. Instead of history books, print spots of ink. We have always lived in fairy tales. For example, I'm the grown-up apple grain, laying supinely, but there is no one to quench first drinking from my eyes. No birds or cows or stray dogs, because the heart has hidden today and the fingers have fallen asleep. How can I even tune the guitar? How can I even sing? I'm tearing my tongue off and throwing it into the sky, because today I want to speak, but the words are useless. I need nothing more, everything becomes clear, as the heart is gone, or maybe the heart has never existed. You just believe the anatomy book, living in a fairy tale. And fingers are now like pencils that lost their hard course, like bees that sting once but never twice. And heart, what is heart? Just empty pen, thinking because of any careless move. And now it has also hidden. Even Julie this time doesn't recite your favorite poets, doesn't even talk to you, removes people, removes fingers, removes heart. And the next short poem I wrote a few weeks before the Russian invasion. But when I changed the ending of the poem, and after February 24th, I returned the original ending. Додому. Одного ранку я прокинувся бомбою і летів стрімголов додому. And the next, and in English it calls back home. Once upon a morning, I woke up being a bomb and flew headlong home. Translated by Victoria Fishuk. And the previous poem translated by Дарина Гладун. Прометей. Вчора я побачив фото мертвого російського солдата з 2 краденими вібраторами в руках. Він тримав їх, наче 2 естафетні палички, навіть більше 2 олімпійські вогні, де замість полум'я жевріло задоволення, яке не зміг донести навіть до кордону. Не спалахнуло воно наповну в якійсь Воркуті чи Мурманську, не відчули його співвітчизники, не дочекалися подвигу. Але російських прометеїв завжди вистачало. Тільки крали вони раніше українську історію, українське мистецтво і далі за списком. Ви й самі все знаєте. От дійшли вже до українського задоволення. Чи відчував солдатик велич свого героїзму? Чи сподівався, що на його честь поставлять пам'ятник, що його іменем назвуть цукерки або черговий російський ракетний комплекс? 2 вібратори – речі, за які варто воювати, речі, за які варто померти. Так, мабуть, він собі думав. Prometheus. Yesterday, I saw a photo of a dead Russian soldier with 2 looted vibrators in his hands. He held them like 2 relay batons, no more, like 2 Olympic torches. Instead of a flame, there flickered a pleasure he could not even carry to the border. It wouldn't blaze full force in some Vorkuta or Murmansk. His compatriots would not feel it, would never see his feet. But then there have always been plenty of Russian Prometheuses. It just they used to steal Ukrainian history, Ukrainian art, and so on down the list. You know it yourself. Now we've gotten to Ukrainian pleasure. Did the little soldier feel the grandeur of his heroism? Was he hoping they'd erect a monument in his honor? Name candies after him, or yet another Russian missile system? 2 vibrators, things worth fighting for, things worth dying for. That's what he must have been thinking. Translated by Alex Averbuch. And the next poem we wrote together with Darina Gladun. It was written in memory of killed people in Bucha who couldn't be identified. Назвати кожного на ім'я. 300 безіменних надходять. Несуть за спинами в руках свої імена. Кістка до кістки, м'яз до м'яза. Складаймо пам'ять про них у наші вірші. Порятовані смертю від життя, назвіться. Зяють дірками їхні роти. На дворі не смерть кістками біліє між листям дерев. Приглядаєшся, таки смерть. На дворі не смерть розквітає на гіллі дерев. Приглядаєшся, таки смерть. На дворі не смерть виспівує птахом між білим гіллям, між білим квітом дерев. Приглядаєшся, таки смерть. Смерте, що порятувала від життя стількох людей. Назви кожного на ім'я. Зяє діркою її рот. Не кості землі, не кров неба, не голоси війни. Ми нічиї. І про кого тоді вся наша пам'ять? Про всіх. А слова наші ні про кого. Про всіх. Кістки наші, м'язи і кров ні про кого. Про всіх. Випадає волосся, ламаються нігті, западають щоки в роти, нічиї. Кістка до кістки, кров до крові, смерть до смерті. Поезія ні для кого, для всіх. Чіпляється до крові, кісток, до води у крані, до піску на скроні, до пальців, до носа, до щелепи, до кожного черепа, реп'яхом, до подолів довгих спідниць і штанів, просить донести її до кращих часів, бодай у роті котрогось із 300 безіменних. Переглядаюсь, таки справді війна, ні для кого, для всіх. To name everyone. 300 nameless walk, holding names behind their backs, bone to bone, muscle to muscle. Let us stretch their memory between our lines. Saved by death from life, name yourself. Mouth holes stare. Outside, it's not death but witness with bones in the leaves of trees. You look closer, but indeed it is death. Outside, it's not death that blooms in the branches of trees. You look closer, but indeed it is death. Outside, it's not death that sings a bird song in the white branches, in the white blossom of trees. You look closer, but indeed it is death. Death, but has saved so many from life. Name everyone by name. The mouth hole of death stares. Not the bones of earth, not the blood of heaven, not the voices of war. We, no one's. And who is our memory about? Everyone. And our words about no one, about everyone. Our bones, our muscles, and blood about no one, about everyone. Hairs falling out, nails split, cheeks sink into mouths. No one's. Bone to bone, blood to blood, death to death. Poetry for no one, for everyone. Grips the blood, the bones, the water in the tap, the sand on the temple, the fingers, the nose, the jaw. Every skull grips the hem like bars, asked to carry it to the better times, carry it at least in the mouth of one, in the mouth of the 300 nameless. I look closer, but indeed it is a war. For no one, to everyone. This poem was translated by Valjena Mort, and it was the last poem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lessing, for sharing your wonderful poems and for giving us an overview of your relationship with poetry over quite a few years. I really like your definition of poetry as a new form of communication. Our last panelist for today is Irina Shuvalova. Irina is a poet and a scholar from Kyiv, now based in Nanjing, China. She holds a PhD in Slavonic Studies from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Gates Cambridge Scholar, and an MA in Comparative Literature from Dartmouth College, where she was a Fulbright Scholar. Her most recent and fifth book of poetry, Stone Orchard Woods 2020, has been named Book of the Year by Ukraine's Litaccent Prize for Literature and received the special prize of the Lviv UNESCO City of Literature Book Award. In 2009, she co-edited 120 pages of Sodom, the first anthology of queer writing in Ukraine, Her poetry has been translated into 23 languages and published internationally, including Modern Poetry in Translation, Asymptote, White Review, Literary Hub, Apophenie, International Poetry Review, and others. Her forthcoming academic monograph, Donbass is My Sparta, Identity and Belonging in the Songs of the Russo-Ukrainian War, explores the impact of the war on Ukrainian society, while her sixth book of poems, The Ending Songs, containing her most recent war poetry, is forthcoming in Ukraine in early 2023. The title of Irina's presentation today is Saying the Unspeakable: Who Should Write About Ukraine's Wartime Plight and How Should They Do It? Please, Irina, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Alessandro, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Just in a moment, I will start sharing my screen. I have some slides. I have put some translations on the slides, and I have also put some words of other poets from Ukraine who are not with us today in this conversation, but who nonetheless I would like to include at least as this absent voices who are invisibly present. I am going to try to do a somewhat difficult thing today, and I will try to wear two of my hats at the same time. And one of those hats is a poet, Ukrainian poet, and then another hat is a scholar. And those two hats are always difficult to balance, but particularly so when we are talking about the current war in Ukraine, because here, obviously, you know, another hat that everyone, all of our speakers almost here are wearing people affected by the war in Ukraine. So that's the third hat. So I will try to juggle these three and perhaps try and reflect on this war, on the writing on this war, especially, I would say, trying to write about this war from a distance, and this question of distance that arises for me personally, because I am not in Ukraine right now. I am in Nanjing, China, from where I'm joining today's conversation, but my partner is in Ukraine. My mother was displaced from Ukraine in the early days of the war. She's in the UK right now. My father and brother are in Ukraine. Like many of us, I am affected, but I am not in immediate physical danger. And that is a huge difference, of course, with the two colleagues who spoke earlier, Leszek and Julia. And so I have been personally thinking about this issue of distance in war writing. And I have also had a chance to engage in this conversation about distance we put between ourselves and this pain that war afflicts on us, or that distance can be just forced on us, right? It's not necessarily a choice. I had that conversation with several groups of learners from outside Ukraine. So one such conversation was with the participants of the Ukraine Lab, which was this absolutely brilliant initiative, which ran just a couple of months ago. It was initiated by the Ukrainian Institute London, and it was a project that brought together several young, promising writers, half of them from Ukraine, half of them from the UK, and all of them writing about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. And so we had a conversation with them, and one of the questions that came up from the British participants was actually, do we have a right to write about this war? How do we do it? How do we do it without appropriating the stories that are being told by people who actually are living through this war, right? We are not there. We are not experiencing this pain directly. Do we have a right to even experience this pain? So that was one conversation I had. And another similar one was also recently when I was teaching a writing workshop for Arvin Foundation, also the UK writing charity, and also with the participants of the workshop, which was about writing on war, that these questions came up. And so the thoughts I will be sharing today, because of course I will not be giving any straightforward answers to these questions. They are way too complicated to attempt anything like that, and perhaps I'm not the person best placed to give those straightforward answers. However, I will share some thoughts that really come as much from those conversations and from people who were part of those conversations as they do from me. So I would like to give credit to those people. And my personal situation when the war broke out was that I was in China. Me and my daughter just had arrived at that point several months before. The escalation of the war happened in February. Of course, it was a shock. Like everyone here, I struggled to process that on the one hand as a person, on the other hand as a poet. I was not sure whether I could write about this. I was not sure how to write about this, even though I have been writing about the war before. The war, as we know, broke out in 2014. However, the scale, the magnitude of what was happening now was something I was not sure I could handle. But well, essentially, you know, the only way to find out whether I would be to start writing. And so I actually want to start with, and just going back to the title of my presentation, because it's slightly different from the earlier ones that Alessandro mentioned before. So it's saying the unspeakable, right? And only after I have put together this presentation and I thought, okay, which of my poems am I going to read today? I went to this very first poem that I wrote, and you see it comes from the cycle Cave Nanjing. It was the cycle that grew out of notes, phrases, things. I was just trying to record the reality, some figments of reality on my phone. I was not making it with an intention to write poetry. I think I was making it more, making those notes more with an intention of just holding on to reality because it was slipping away from me. I think a feeling many here would share. And so then suddenly, yes, I did start writing something out of those little fragments, and it grew out into this cycle called Cave Nanjing. And it was really written in the first 3 days since the full-scale Russian invasion started. And it has been beautifully translated by Yulia Yuchuk and Amelia Glazer. And I looked at the very first poem of the cycle, which you see on your screens right now, and it is called The Unspeakable. And that's why I think for me, it's the concept, the word that really signifies something that lies at the core of the experience of war. It's something that's impossible to grasp fully. And at first, I thought that I wasn't able to grasp it fully because I was not there, right? The bombs were not falling on me. But then I spoke to other people who were, and they said, the fact that we lived through it doesn't mean that we fully grasp this. I don't think we would be able, one friend told to me, I don't think I would be able to go through, you know, through the routine just to keep living if I realized every moment of my day, the scale of the horrors happening. And so I'll just start by reading this poem. And this is what I'm going to try and do for the rest of my talk, just mix a bit of my thoughts, perhaps an attempt of scholarly reflections, and the poems that perhaps relate to this. So I will read the Ukrainian and the English version for this one, and for some further poems, I will just read the Ukrainian version, and the English one you will be able to see on your screens and follow along. Невимовне, the unspeakable. Ось, тут воно лежить, це невимовне. Важке, як мертве тіло дорогої людини. Довге, як ніч, коли мають бомбити. Бери невимовне, попід мокрі від крові пахви. Тягни його, лишай сліди. Нехай на ранок їх буде видно здалеку. The unspeakable. Look, here it lies, the unspeakable. heavy as a loved one's dead body, long as night when they're bombing, takes the unspeakable under its blood-soaked arms, pull it, leave tracks. In the morning, may these red tracks be seen from afar. And so very quickly, I'm just going to throw in one perspective that has helped me to think about this phenomenon of the unspeakable in the context of the war, and has helped me to speak about it, paradoxically, of course. So this was Susan Sontag's last book, the cover for which you see on your slides, Regarding the Pain of Others. And this was a book that largely grappled with the purpose of war photography. Sontag sort of doesn't really give an answer what that purpose is and whether that purpose is, noble. She arrives at two conclusions simultaneously, essentially. She says that images of violence, yes, they can sometimes, as she puts it, shock people into awareness. But at the same time, they can achieve the opposite effect. Sort of the images of violence produce this hunger, desire for more images of violence. And so she says that this might just lead to the numbing of the senses and create appetite for more shock. And this is a quote of hers that I would like to share. She describes one of the photographs with people directly affected by the war in that photograph. And she says this: why should they seek our gaze? What would they have to say to us? We, this we, is everyone who has never experienced anything like what they went through, don't understand. We don't get it. We truly can't imagine what it was like. We can't imagine how dreadful, how terrifying war is, and how normal it becomes. Can't understand, can't imagine. That's what every soldier and every journalist and aid worker and independent observer who has put in time under fire and had the luck to elude the death that struck down others nearby stubbornly feels, and they're right. So this is what Sontag says. And obviously this is about the observers, right? This is from the people on the outside of the war. But I actually have another quote here, and this comes from someone from inside Ukraine, someone who has experienced the war and who has been affected by this war. This is one of the voices I want to bring into this conversation. It's Iya Kiva, a poet translator from Donetsk originally, who was displaced by the outbreak of the war in 2014, relocated to Kyiv, and then she was displaced for the second time when bombs started falling on Kyiv after the recent escalation, and she had to move to Lviv. And she says, even sort of from the insider's perspective, she says, I can't imagine how one could share a displaced person's experience. It would be like sharing an experience of peritonitis. You can describe it endlessly, but another person will hurt differently. So essentially, even on the inside, right, we have this variety of experiences. We have the depths of individual experience, which is such that really, even when the context is shared, everyone, as Iya puts it, everyone will hurt differently. So how do we try to capture this variety of pain in a writing? Do we try to do that? What is the purpose of poetry in war in general, in this war in particular? So before I attempt to answer that question, again, not my answer, an answer that also comes from another voice inside Ukraine, I just wanted to read another poem of mine. And like I said, this impossibility of really capturing things, right? This unspeakability of the experience of war is very confounding. And so I have this cycle of, I actually don't remember, I think it's 6 poems that is called To Write About War. And this translation has been done beautifully by Nina Murray. And this is the first poem from the cycle. This is sort of me trying to grapple with this unspeakability. And I will read this one in English. So I can't locate the Ukrainian version right now on my computer. There is no language that could possibly hold all of this. To write about war is to swallow barbed wire, inch by inch, slowly. To wrap your bare arms and legs around an anti-tank hedgehog when you are asleep. To screw metal wards into the crushed bones of the morning, one after another. To shell the bean pods of your wards open like bullet casings. To shake loose death, black lentils, pain peas of lead. To drink from puddles, first the deafening rumble, then the thick scarlet silence. So really, the immediate writings that might happen, if it happens at all, in the wake of trying to capture something like this in writing is sometimes, for me, it was very physical, just registering what is happening, how it feels to try and talk about this. And I know that many poets, including the poet I have here next on my screen, Ostap Slivinsky, he said that writing has been very, very difficult for him since the war broke out. And he mostly has been actually collecting and documenting other people's voices and experiences. He has a wonderful project called the War Lexicon, because Ostap volunteers extensively. He has been interacting with people fleeing the war, coming from different parts of Ukraine, and he has been recording their stories and making them into this lexicon, the dictionary of war, a story per word in it. But here I want to draw your attention to something that might help us perhaps answer this question. So what do we do with poetry in the time of war? Like, what can poetry do? And Ostap offers this metaphor of poetry as a sieve. And I just invite you to read this quote from one of his interviews, or perhaps it was an essay. Apologies, I don't recall now, where he comes up with this metaphor. So after spending a long time asking what poetry means, amidst ruins and explosions, amidst the very great number of various forms of suffering, I have temporarily agreed to one comparison. Poetry is a sieve, sito. Yes, in the times when no imagination can quite live up to the terrible reality, when reality itself becomes too much, so that to magnify it with make-believe seems like a criminal act, while running away from it constitutes cowardice. The only thing literature can do is bear witness. Yet literature is not a loudspeaker of reality, not a newsfeed and not television footage. What it can do is filter the lived reality so that it becomes a universal experience. That's what the sieve is. So that's one tentative answer to the question. Really sort of filtering this experience of war and making it into something that can be more universal in the way it communicates, that things that, as we said now, looking through E.S. quotation, looking through Susan Sontag's quotation, some things that can't really be shared fully, right? But we need to find a way, and perhaps poetry might be one such way to express the inexpressible. And again, I was looking back at Kiev Nanjing's A Cycle written in the first days of war. Again, this is a translation by Yulia Ilchuk and Emilia Glazer. And this is the final poem of the cycle. So I started with the first one. This is the final poem. And it's called Svoyi in Ukrainian, which means your own. And again, after reading Ostap's quote, after having put this whole presentation together, I was looking at my own writing and I saw suddenly, this motives just being there. I never saw them before. So there you go, universality, perhaps. Свої. Кожен розбомблений дім на фото спершу здається своїм. Кожна дитина, що спить у київському метро, має обличчя твоєї доньки. Новини стаються не з нами, стаються з нами. Жінка на фото, що затуляє розпачливою долонею жалібно скривлений рот. Я не знаю цієї жінки. Я знаю цю жінку. And just one last thing that I would like to reflect on before we finish today. And again, it's an open-ended question. The question of distance. Like I said, this is something that came up in my conversation with other readers, other writers, again and again. This question of how do we really factor in this distance or lack of such really that exists between us and the war we are attempting to write about. And this is another voice I want to bring into this conversation. That's Halina Kruk, a wonderful poet from Lviv, a scholar. And in one of her interviews, when reflecting on her own writing during the war, Halina said this: like most of us, I can't treat the war as raw material, can't separate it from myself. We are living in the fight and survival mode. It's not the best mindset for creative distancing and reflection. Because speaking about the war directly doesn't work. It's like retelling your newsfeed. I think, she says, that the literature of the future will not operate quite as directly. And quite possibly the strongest work about this war will not be written by a Ukrainian author. That's a very interesting thought. A thought that, frankly, a lot of my interlocutors from outside Ukraine find striking, because obviously they feel, if they attempt to write about this war, they feel quite often, not all of them, but as imposters. But coming from someone inside Ukraine, and Halina is incredibly involved, she's volunteering nonstop, she's a very vocal advocate, speaking very actively, just like Yulia here, for example, and Lasik, at various events about this war, raising awareness. Helena's husband is also fighting in the war. And so coming from someone like that, that's a very strong statement that perhaps we actually need that distance to fully comprehend or start, even begin to comprehend what is really happening, the meaning of it. And so just to finish today, yeah, I want to read perhaps one last poem. Let me move to the, actually, let me read it in Ukrainian first, and then we will move to English. I will finish with the English version. And this was an attempt, my attempt, to reflect on that distance and whether I have the right about this war. And again, my attempt to ask the question, really, not to answer it. And the poem is called If, and it's Якщо in Ukrainian. Якщо мене не вбивають, чи маю право я говорити із тими, кого вбивають, на рівних? Чи маю я право боліти, якщо не маю рани? Скаржитись, якщо не маю втрати? Чи маю право на безсоння, коли тут не чути сирен? Близькість смерті тепер лежить між нами на столі, як хлібина із запеченим усередині ножем. Якщо мене не вбивають, що я можу сказати тим, кого так? Адже переломившися через смерть, мова стає сама на себе не схожа. І ось ми з тобою вже не говоримо однією. І зрештою, якщо мене не вбивають, чи маю право я хотіти тримати тебе так само міцно, як звикла тримати перед тим, коли не вбивали ще жодну з нас? And this is the English translation of this poem. Actually, sorry, the information on the slide in the left is incorrect. This translation was done by Virlana Tkach and Wanda Phipps. So many apologies for the incorrect information. I just copy-pasted and didn't correct. If I am not being killed, do I have the right to talk with those who are being killed as an equal? Do I have the right to hurt if I'm not wounded, or complain if I haven't suffered losses? Do I have the right to sleepless nights if sirens do not wail here? Now death's proximity lies on the table between us like a loaf of bread with a knife baked into it. If I am not being killed, what can I say to those who are, whose language has been cracked open by death, so it no longer resembles itself? Now we no longer speak the same one. So if I am not being killed, do I have the right to want to hold you as tightly as I used to before, when neither of us were being killed? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Irena, for one more extremely fascinating presentation in which you skillfully combined your own poems with your own perspectives, some scholarly insights into the questions that we are discussing today, and also voices from other Ukrainian poets. I think that was really amazing. So we don't have much time left. We basically have, well, 13 minutes, I think. I haven't seen any questions coming. I see one right now. I guess people were, of course, busy listening to our panelists and to their insights and their beautiful poems. I see 2 questions at the moment. I don't think we have time for more. So let me now read aloud the first one, which is by Sweta Gupta. Speaking of distance, I believe that the quantum entanglement will solve the same as in some deeper mythology. Everything is connected to be observed in hindsight. I have my flight transit in Ukraine as well as Russia. My name derives its meaning from Russian translation and my appreciation to beauty both towards Ukraine. If this upheaval has incurred, my prayers for peace, unity, and prosperity. Thank you so much. And then I'll read both of them since we are basically running out of time. Then we have a question from Konstantina Batsuli. Thank you very much for taking the time. What do you think the role of poetry is in forming a Ukrainian national identity following February? So, well, I think that we now have a bit of not so much time, but still a few minutes to discuss these questions. So I now invite all of you to answer Konstantina's question and maybe comment on Sweta's comment if you'd like, or add any other considerations that you haven't had time to discuss yet. So please, who would like to start?
I can start. Or
Great.
I think Ukrainians now rediscover themselves for themselves, and they try to understand this new reality, what they feel, what is happen, and understand the Ukraine and their belonging.
Thank you, Leszek.
I can continue.
Thank you, Yulia.
I'd like to start with just reminding that the role of poetry in Ukraine is pretty huge, that our basically a national symbol, one of our greatest national symbols is a poet, Taras Shevchenko. So I have been asked this question many times abroad, how great is poetry in Ukraine? And I answered that, well, it's huge. So people are uniting through the poetry, and also the role of poets in war is not just writing poems, but being a part of the volunteer movement, like, for example, Serhiy Zhadan, and being a part of cultural diplomacy, as Irina already mentioned. So I think the potential of poetry, we will see what impact it will have in the long term, but currently with the social media being a platform for publishing the poetry, and the poetry dedicated to war, poetry reacting very quickly to the events, I think it unites people around this collective emotion, and it also gives strength. It is, as I mentioned in my presentation, gives this coping mechanism, and I think it has a lot of influence, and it helps a lot.
Thank you very much, Julia.
I might jump in here and do those horrible things that no panelist should do and answer a slightly different question from the one asked, because I think the question is really not just about identity in poetry, right? It's also about identity in war, in a sense, right? Because we are talking in a very specific context. And at the risk of raising some eyebrows, I will say that I think there is this idea, which is quite popular outside Ukraine, that this war has forged the Ukrainian identity, that this was like this breaking point and everyone came together and became united, and suddenly Ukrainians realized they were Ukrainians. Again, I think people are forgetting that the war has been going on since 2014. Yes, it does have a huge impact on how people think about ourselves. But I think we're also forgetting that identity is not something set in stone, right? And this is me also speaking as a scholar who has studied questions related to identity in this war, right? Identity is something that's fluctuating all the time, and that will continue to fluctuate. And yes, it's very, very interesting and important to see these processes happening right now. But also, I am very, very curious what will happen after the war will end, and the war will end. And I think we can see by how invested everyone in Ukraine is into the war effort. This war will only end with Ukraine's victory. And what happens next is something I'm most interested in, because right now we don't have a choice, and we have been put in the situations that we have to define ourselves in opposition to Russia and to the Russian identity, and any elements in our identities that are somehow connected to Russia, right? But that has to stop, and it will stop. And I think this is something that everyone just wants not to happen anymore. We won't need to think about Russia. We will not need to think about Russian bombs. We will not need to think about Russian books. We can finally come into our own and then figure out a lot of new things about ourselves. And so I think that will be a really, really fascinating stage. And again, maybe I'm speaking as a scholar who will observe that stage, I hope, but also as someone, I'm watching what's going to happen with my own identity. How am I going to think about myself in a new way?
Thank you very much, Irina. William, is there anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I think Irina basically made a similar point I would make. And I think the question is a very good one, and it's absolutely correct. And Julia also outlined really what the role of poetry has always been in Ukrainian culture. But yeah, it is strange that often when this is not, I think, underlying this question, but often when people talk about Ukrainian culture, they talk about it being somehow, discovered or being reborn, or talk about the formation of the identity after this war, after 2014, after 1991, and so on and so on, as if somehow before that it was not formed, or was somehow dormant or didn't exist in some way. And it's the strange thing that you have to keep, you know, as someone who teaches and explains Ukrainian culture, to explain to people, actually, you know, this is like any other national culture, any other identity. It's been around for a long time. It appeared around about the same time as all the other national identities in Europe, at least. And it's changed, and it's constantly changing. And it's changing now, and it's changing in, you know, extremely interesting ways. But it's not something that just appeared in February or in 2014 or in 1991 or in 1917 or whenever, you know.
Thank you very much, Ujan. Thank you very much to all panelists for, yes, really making it clear that Ukrainian identity exactly has been developing over a very long period of time, and it's not something new, even if quite a few people have been noticing it only over the last 8 months or something. So I see that we have one more comment from Sweta. In the world where diversity and inclusion is essential for poetic minds to find inspiration, how do we reject or accept the fundamental elements based on the political events? And well, I think that Irena especially already partially answered this problem. I mean, we don't know how what is going to happen after Ukrainian victory, how identity will develop. As you rightly pointed, Irena, identity is not something set in stone. So we will see what is going to happen, and I guess we're going to observe many more fascinating developments over the next few years. So I'm sure there are more questions from the public, and of course we could keep on discussing these fascinating, even if of course very painful questions, but we are running out of time. So I'd like to thank our panelists a lot for finding time to join us today. I know how extremely busy you are coping with your work, volunteering for Ukraine, teaching. You're extremely busy these days. Plus, of course, you may have technical difficulties linked to the war. So thank you very much for finding the time and the energy to join us today. And well, even if I work on a daily basis with Ukrainian poetry, really I learned a lot today. So thank you very much once again. And you have also pointed out that many of the poems that you have shared with us today are available, well, of course, both in Ukrainian, but also in English translation. That is great. So for those in the audience, you can look for the poems that have been read today, and you can find also other poems. So there's a lot of Ukrainian poetry is being translated today. That is great, much more than before February of this year. So there's really a lot that you can read, that you can discover, a lot of food for thought. And as I'm sure you have had the chance to appreciate, it's really high quality poetry. So there's really a lot that you can discover for yourselves. And I'd also like to remind everyone in the audience and the panelists as well that this is not the last webinar of this series, of the Russia's War on Ukraine series. We have one more webinar upcoming on the 11th of November, Friday the 11th of November, and it's titled Reconstruction. So a very important topic, and I'm sure this is going to be a great webinar too. Sorry, rebuilding, yes, not reconstruction, rebuilding. So thank you very much. Once again, this webinar will be available on YouTube and on the blog of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies of the University of Melbourne. Thank you very much once again, and I hope to see you around soon.